Stanford University.
Welcome. Welcome to Stanford Medicine's Contemplation by Design Summit. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, founder and director of Contemplation by Design. It's my great honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Fleet Maull. He'll be speaking to us about radical responsibility, integrating individual and collective responsibility for personal and social transformation. Fleet Maull is an author, meditation teacher, social entrepreneur, business consultant, executive coach, and trainer who works at the nexus of personal and social transformation. He is a senior Dharma teacher in the global Shambhala Meditation Community and a Roshi, which is a Zen master, in the International Zen Peacemaker Order. Dr. Maull founded Heart-Mind Institute, Prison Mindfulness Institute, and National Prison Hospice Association, and co-founded the Rwanda Bearing Witness Retreat, the Center of Mindfulness and Public Safety, and the Engaged Mindfulness Institute. He trains prisoners, business leaders, correctional officers, law enforcement, and other public safety professionals in mindfulness-based approaches to deepening wellness and resiliency. He is author of the book Radical Responsibility: How to Move Beyond Blame, Fearlessly Live Your Highest Purpose, and Become an Unstoppable Force for Good. Other publications are Dharma in Hell, The Prison Writings of Fleet Maull, and The Resilience CO, Neuroscience-Informed Mindfulness-Based Wellness and Resiliency for Correction Professionals. He leads meditation retreats throughout the world and recently organized and hosted the Global Resilience Summit. We warmly welcome Fleet Maull.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of your summit, and thank you for the kind introduction. So it's really great to be with all of you, and I think I'd like to start out by just inviting us to participate in this presentation today and the workshop tomorrow in a very embodied way. So I'd like to invite everyone, if you're willing, to just perhaps close your eyes for a moment or lower your gaze and just feel into being present in our bodies right now. Just kind of checking in with whatever we're experiencing at the sensory level with the body. Do we feel awake or a little sleepy? Do we feel energized or a little lethargic? What do we notice in the body? How are we, just feeling our body and on the chair, the cushion, whatever our situation is, our feet on the ground. Being curious about all the different sensations we can feel all across the surface of the skin from head to toe, which could include sensations related to the contact between our skin and our clothing or the weight of our clothing, the pressure points where our body meets the chair, the cushion, where our feet meet the ground, as well as the passage of air across the nostrils and or parted lips with each in-breath and out-breath. And of course, with any mindfulness-based embodiment practice, if you notice your mind wandering off into one distraction or another, we just come back and drop into perhaps a little deeper curiosity about what it feels like to be present in the body at this moment. And we could also be curious about all the internal sensations we're feeling within the body, activating our innate capacity for what's known as interoception or interoceptive awareness. This is the body's capacity to feel itself from the inside out, as it were. And also based on the fact that the entire body is sensory, all the way down to the bones and including the bones, all containing neuronal cells connected to the central nervous system, and thus all sensory. So that includes also the musculature, all our vital organs, circulatory system, the entire body. And as we continue to feel into the body and just sort of bring ourselves into this moment, being present with however it feels to be in our body at this moment, I just invite a couple of reflections. One is that when we think about body or even bring our attention to body, what we're first coming to on some level is probably our conceptual body, the body made up of our thoughts and feelings about the body, our images, our memories. My first mindfulness teacher, meditation teacher, made the distinction between that conceptual body that he called psychosomatic body, and then what he called body, which is the actual direct experience in the moment of the physical sensations that make up the experience we call body. Body, of course, just being a word or a concept, but there's a lived experience in the moment. So feeling into that. And also just noticing that all sensations arise across the spectrum from pleasant to neutral to unpleasant. Everything from comfortable to not so comfortable, pleasurable to painful, everything in between. So just noticing that and being willing to just feel whatever's there. We're fairly hardwired to constantly chase comfort and avoid discomfort, chase pleasure and avoid pain. And one of the ways that we can awaken and really become truly embodied is just to embrace the full spectrum of our experience in the moment. Because there's always going to be sensations that arise as pleasant, neutral, and unpleasant. So just inviting us to really kind of take our seat now and be fully present in the body. And as we go through today's program with the lecture I'm giving, be curious about what you feel in the body as you're going through it and how you notice responding to certain things I say. There may be things I say that you find yourself really agreeing to, and there'll be a correlate experience in the body that goes along with that. There may be things I'm saying that you're not so sure about, or even that you disagree with, and then there'll be a correlated experience in the body. And it's also helpful to reflect that all those reactions are basically, it's our conditioning that's agreeing or not agreeing or questioning. But if we really go with the body, we can drop into a deeper level and actually access our inner wisdom, innate intelligence that's maybe a bit deeper and more interesting, actually, than our initial conditioned reactions. So just inviting that curiosity about our experience, and no right or wrong about any of it. Whatever your experience is today, that's your experience, and invite you to really honor that. So just invite us all to keep coming back to that sense of being in the body today, whenever you can remember to do so. Maybe I'll remind us here and there. So I'd like to start off by saying that everything I'm going to share today, on the one hand, is simply my opinion. I don't claim to any kind of truths per se, but it is a fairly reflective and considered opinion and based on my experience. So I'm going to be speaking from my experience and what I've learned over the years. But I really want people to receive it as such, that I'm not asserting something that you have to or should agree with or not agree with. I'm just sharing my experience. So today's theme is what I call radical responsibility, which is the integration of both personal and collective responsibility. Now, I have a book out, Radical Responsibility, and it's mostly about the personal side of it, because I really feel that's where we need to begin. I'm working on a second book now that'll be more about the collective part. But I feel like we need to begin with personal responsibility, because I think when we try to do collective responsibility without having embraced personal responsibility, it doesn't work out so well. And that's part of what I'll be addressing today, because I think there's a lot of that going on in our social and cultural landscape today. Well intended, but I think if we don't really do our own work, it's hard to be really clear about how we're engaging with the outer world and what's actually going to be beneficial and what may be not so beneficial. So I'm going to start really focusing here on the personal responsibility aspect of it, and then we'll move into the collective. And also, just to let you know, today I'm going to be sharing ideas and this kind of theoretical framework, and sharing some of the background of that in my own personal experience. And tomorrow, when we're doing the workshop, it'll be purely experiential, and I'll be leading you through processes which will actually really land the distinctions I'm talking about today in a really experiential way for you in your body and in your mind, right? So just so you know, that's coming tomorrow. So one of the, sometimes when asked to describe radical responsibility, I describe it as voluntarily embracing 100% responsibility or ownership for each and every circumstance we face in life. Now, on the face of that, that probably sounds reasonable, sounds like a good idea. But if we really think about it and take it very deeply, we'll quickly realize how challenging that really is. And that includes sort of two sets of experiences. It includes experiences that we can, upon reflection, see that, or experience or circumstances. I'll use the term circumstances we find ourselves in or find ourselves experiencing that may be pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant, that we may be happy about or not so happy about. That we're embracing 100% responsible ownership for two sets of those. One being those which we can see upon reflection that maybe we had something to do with, at least some part to play in either literally causing them, or perhaps we have unconscious things going on that are kind of setting ourselves up unconsciously to be in those kind of circumstances. There's a term from transactional analysis called life scripts that develop early in childhood. And the idea is we kind of keep playing these out until we become aware of them and don't. And so is there any kind of unconscious processes that are going on where we're kind of setting ourselves up to end up in a circumstance we're not so happy about? And then also maybe we're just allowing circumstances to happen just because we're not paying attention, or we're not mindful, or we're kind of in terms of interpersonal situations, maybe we're kind of being lazy communicators, and a lot of us are, or we're being conflict avoidant. We're not doing our due diligence. We're not having the difficult conversations we need to have. So there could be all kinds of things going on that are allowing situations to happen, beginning with just not being aware, not being very present or mindful could allow things to happen. So there's all kinds of ways in which we might see that, we had some participation in a particular circumstance arising in our life. And the reason we look at that has nothing to do with self-blame, and I'll cover that in a moment. It is only for the purpose of learning. Then the other set of circumstances that we would also embrace 100% responsibility or ownership for are those circumstances which we can't see we had anything to do with at all. We get radically honest and deeply reflect, and I just can't see that I had anything to do with that. It literally feels like it fell out of the sky and landed in my lap. And everybody would agree, right? So we also embrace 100% ownership for that. Now, what would that mean? We're going to explore that, because that obviously probably sounds a bit more daunting. So the first thing is that the most important distinction in the radical responsibility model is the distinction between ownership and blame. Radical responsibility has absolutely nothing to do with blame. It's obviously not about blaming others, but it has not one iota to do with blaming ourselves. And it certainly has nothing to do with blaming victims. It's a trans blame model. It's beyond blame. It's really about ownership. Now, I could have called it radical ownership. I felt the term radical responsibility back when I made that decision years ago was going to be more evocative and kind of provoking. But you could call it ownership or responsibility. And it means we're taking ownership for the circumstances we find ourselves in moment to moment. Now, it is very helpful to look into circumstances, especially those we're not so thrilled with, and really try to understand, is there any way that I'm participating in this? any way that I'm creating this or allowing it, or I have some unconscious dynamics going on that are setting me up for this. Because if I learn that, then I can make different choices in the future to get different results, right? Even if I understood, the root of how I got somewhere, back there I turned left and turned right, and here I am. Well, understanding that now, I would make a new choice and end up in a different set of circumstances that might be more preferable. So it's purely for the purpose of learning. Now, that's challenging to do. That's challenging to do. And that's why where the radical responsibility model really begins is through experiential contemplative means, contemplative practices, discovering that range of our own being where our own innate unconditional goodness, wholeness is unmistakable. And all of the world's wonderful contemplative practices allow us, through different techniques, different means, to eventually drop beneath the noise of our daily lives, right? The very busy, overactive default mode network in the brain with all the discursiveness, constant rumination about the past and the future, and running commentary about the present, all of that going on. To drop beneath all that, to drop beneath the world of being distracted by external circumstances, and drop into a level of our being where we will directly experience that beyond any doubt, we are not broken. We don't need fixing. We're not missing anything. We're completely whole, innately good, really even, you could say, innately pure. This is, if anyone's familiar with, this is talked about in all the great spiritual traditions. In my core tradition, my teacher called it simply basic goodness. And what he meant by that was this unconditional, primordial, innate wholeness, goodness. It's not so much good versus bad, but it's a deeper kind of good. And in the Buddhist tradition, it's called Buddha nature. In Christianity, it could be called Christ nature, or being a child of God. In many different traditions, what we talked about as our divinity. There's lots of different terms for it. I like the term basic goodness. It's very simple and straightforward. And if people are familiar with the model internal family systems, Richard Schwartz's work, they talk about, the I. We think of we're this one I, this one me, and it's actually all the psychological traditions have pointed to a multiplicity of subpersonalities that make up that I that we assume to be one person, one personality. And when we begin to explore those, whether it's internal family systems or other models, we begin to get in touch with a larger sense of self, or a deeper sense of self that's experiencing, in which all those subpersonalities are happening, or all those voices. In voice dialogue, they're called voices. In internal family systems, they're called parts. And as you begin to tune in at that level, you get in touch with that part of your being that's able to reflect on and experience all those parts, voices, or subpersonalities. And that part of us that's able to experience that, in internal family systems, they call it the self with a capital S. And, again, that's getting into that territory of beingness. Many of the great traditions point to it as a witnessing, that we have an awareness that simply witnesses our experience, that is really deeper or beyond anything we would relate to specifically to our personality. It's simply pure awareness. And it is our true being. And all the great spiritual traditions point to this, and it could even be God within, however one wants to understand it, but it's a deeper level of our being. And the important thing about that, and this is pointed to in internal family systems and many other models, that part of our being has never been damaged. It's never been damaged, right? There are all kinds of parts and subpersonalities and parts of ourselves. And one of the simple models we've all heard about is the idea of the inner child work, right? There's the inner child. So these different aspects of ourselves can be traumatized, and this is reflected obviously in our neurobiology, but there's a level of our being that's untouched by all that. And so through contemplative practice, getting in touch with that then allows us to embrace radical levels of ownership and responsibility, radical levels of self-honesty, self-reflection, really being able to look at ourselves without that triggering us into some kind of self-blame, without that triggering us into some kind of self-shaming. So this is really important. So radical responsibility is grounded in a deep contemplative experience that gives us the resilience and the context to really approach our lives and ourselves with this radical level of ownership, responsibility, honesty, without it triggering us into some kind of self-blaming or self-shaming. So that's really important. So that core distinction, again, is that radical responsibility has nothing to do with blame. It's completely beyond blame. So then I mentioned that other set of circumstances, the ones that we can't see that we had any connection to at all. You know, if people consider the idea of multiple births, multiple lifetimes, it could be, you know, past karma, who knows about such a thing, but none of us know how that works and we can't really establish it. So, and even if it was some other version of me lifetimes ago created a situation that I'm not experiencing, it doesn't help so much. It could help cognitively, but anyway. So leaving that aside, we're really talking about circumstances that, at least in terms of our current life, we can't see we had anything to do with at all. So why would we want to embrace those? And how could we embrace ownership for those without it being some form of self-blame? Right? How could we embrace total ownership for circumstances that we find ourselves in that we can't see we had anything to do with without that being some form of self-blame? Well, it's not. It's not about somehow, well, it must somehow be my fault. Again, this is not about fault. It's not about blame. It says, here's the circumstance I'm in. I really would like to know how I got here, because then I could learn and, you know, take different strategies in the future that would work out better. But I really can't see I had anything to do with it. So what am I left with? Well, the circumstance is here, right? The circumstance is here. It already happened. It's in my life, whatever it is. And these can be small moment-to-moment, momentary experiences, or big things that can happen in our life. And it could be things that are tremendously unjust, or even things that really, you know, create a lot of trauma. And of course, we may feel, and very naturally feel, especially in severe situations, it's much better actually to practice this model with all the little day-to-day things, and we get better and better at it before we try to tackle the great big ones, right? But, you know, even in the case of experiences that may be very traumatic, or everyone would agree are highly unjust or even criminal, and it will be completely natural that we're going to feel victimized, and we may need that affirmed, and we may need a lot of support for that. And at the same time, at some point, for us personally, the most salient question is going to be, what am I going to do with this? What am I going to do with this? Am I going to let it take me down? Or am I somehow going to find the resources within myself, and possibly from the support of others, to make the most creative choices I can make to embrace the reality of the situation I'm in and move my life forward in the best way, in the most beneficial way for myself and others? Right? So I'm faced with that choice, and we're all faced with that choice constantly, every moment of our lives, around all the little minutiae of our daily experience, as well as the big things that happen and everything in between. We're constantly living a choice. The question is, do we recognize that? And do we really recognize how much agency we have? So ultimately, that's what radical responsibility really is about. It's about choice. And there is the part where we'll dig in and see if, you know, is there anything I can understand about how I got into this circumstance, or if it's collective, how we got into this circumstance, for the purpose of learning and developing more wisdom and skills and discernment, so I make new and different choices going forward in my life, that we collectively can make new and different choices that are going to lead to better outcomes. And then there's those where we do all that reflection and we just don't find anything. But then ultimately, in both circumstances, the really important thing at that point is choice. What am I going to do? Right? What am I going to do with this circumstance? Because that is what's really going to determine the future, my own future personally and our future collectively. Now, these are not new ideas. Many of you have probably heard of the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, who was considered the last good Roman emperor and one of the Stoic philosophers. And, it's a wonderful collection of meditations, which I highly recommend. And this is kind of a paraphrase of one, but basically he said something like most people feel like their destiny is determined by their circumstances. That's what most people assume, that their destiny is determined by their circumstances. He said, no, that's not actually the case. Our destiny is determined by our response to those circumstances, So although there are all kinds of causes and conditions that have contributed to where we find ourselves in life at any given moment, there can be all kinds of parts of that landscape and causes and conditions that may be wonderful and beneficial and supportive, and we may feel fortunate and privileged, grateful. And there may be all kinds of causes and conditions that are not fortunate and that have really kind of gotten in our way and set us up for challenges and difficulties, and may be very unjust and things that we would like to change in the world so fewer and fewer people experience them. Right? So there's all these contributing factors to how we arrive at any moment in life. But at that moment, we're at a choice point. What am I going to do with this? Am I going to let, my own conditioning and unconscious reactivity take me down a pathway that's not really, even in my own enlightened self-interest, not going to lead to very good results? Or am I going to embrace ownership and say, here I am, I don't like this. It doesn't feel right, feels unjust, feels so-and-so. And, part of my moving forward may be to seek justice and try to change things. But nonetheless, what am I going to do? How am I going to respond to this in the most creative way I can, even in my own enlightened self-interest, to move my own life forward in a good way, right? So we're living at that choice point every moment of our life. And for the most part, we haven't been trained to embrace living that way. Right? Our general culture does not train us to live that way. There are many psychotherapeutic traditions here in our Western culture, many within the human potential movement going back into the 60s, that really do focus on training oneself to live at choice, is sometimes the way it's called. But it's not the general culture. And all the great contemplative traditions also talk about this. And usually the basic training when one goes into various specific contemplative traditions in great depth, the basic training is really often has to do with training ourselves how to actually embrace this level of personal responsibility and ownership, and kind of fully become adults and embrace our lives and responsibility for our own lives. That's kind of foundational to any training. So I want to talk a little bit about, how did I come to this this model of radical responsibility. And again, this is, these similar ideas have been around for quite a while. I think connecting it in the way that I do with the depth of contemplative experience that allows us to develop confidence in our own innate goodness and the resilience that comes along with that, as well as deeply embodied mindfulness practices that really get us in touch with sort of bandwidth within our neurobiological part of our being, that also are sources for tremendous resilience and strength. That connecting personal ownership and personal responsibility with that, I think, is part of what really makes it work and may be unique. And again, I'm not saying it's completely unique, because historically this has been part of spiritual traditions and addressed in various ways. But in today's world, there's a lot out there around kind of just mental toughness and, that kind of thing of, the should do it, just be responsible, take ownership, without really letting us know how to do it, how to get there psychological, but also without that piece, which I think is an incredibly important piece of doing it from that ground of confidence in our own being, so we can completely disconnect it from any potential for any kind of blame of ourselves, others, victims, anyone else, or any kind of self-shaming or shaming of others. So you probably already know from my bio and having before you signed up for this program that part of my personal history is that I spent 14 years in a federal prison. That was from 1985 to 1999. So how did I get there? Kind of an interesting path. And actually, when I got there, I'm very fortunate that I got there. I already had a master's degree in Buddhist and Western psychology. It's a program at Naropa University. It's now called master's degree in contemplative psychotherapy. It's the same program, different name. And I had already been practicing meditation for a long time, was already trained to teach meditation, So that really begs the question of how did I still manage to get myself locked up, right? So I'm a baby boomer. I'm 72 years old. I came of age during the 60s and 1950s and 60s. And I grew up in a middle-class Roman Catholic family in the Midwest, and basically a good family with good values. My father, a good provider, but we had alcoholism in the family. And my beloved mother suffered from alcoholism, and it was kind of periodic, what you might call episodic or periodic alcoholism, where once or twice a week she would drink, and within a period of hours become a complete, very, from my perspective as a child, a terrifying rageaholic. And usually when we got home from school, we could tell if that was going on, and then we knew, that our home life was just going to erupt into chaos. When my father got home and dinner became absolute chaos, and my mother attacking my father, and he didn't know how to deal with it. And this was back in the 1950s. There was very little knowledge around addiction and alcoholism back then. And my parents were, less likely to find their way into AA or something like that because they were, kind of middle class, moving in the direction of upper middle class. Not there when I grew up, but but appearances were important to them and those kind of things. So, at any rate, if my father happened to be out on business or something, and I had a brother who was 6 years older, so at some certain point he was gone. I'm sure he suffered with it for a while, and then when he was gone, my mother would come after me and be attacking me, and sometimes violently, physically. And then the next, and at some point she would pass out, and we'd all go to sleep. And you wake up in the morning and you come down for breakfast, and there would be my smiling mother, my usual mother, who, when she didn't drink, was this amazing, beautiful, artistic, incredibly intelligent, wonderful person and good mother. And there she would be making breakfast like nothing ever happened. And it was never talked about. Well, you can imagine how, the episode's bad enough, but that the way it was just never talked about, never dealt with, you can imagine how splitting that is to one's psyche when you're growing up. So by the time I arrived in adolescence, I was kind of a classic angry young man with a big hole in my gut. The other part of my experience was that I remember as a child feeling I was living in this really vivid, magical world, and feeling just really plugged into reality, and everything was just very vivid and magical. And it was somewhere around the start of, starting school, going to kindergarten. Maybe that was around the same time my mother's alcoholism surfaced, that everything just kind of went to gray tones. The magic went away. And I found myself, really disconcerted and confused by that. And that began a search really to reclaim some way to be plugged into reality again and experience into vivid magic of daily life. And so that took me down a lot of twisted roads because, of course, I became very attracted to drugs and sex and rock and roll and the whole thing of the counterculture. And, there were experiences within all that had some level of feeling more real, but, on some level they're mirage-like. And if you have a big hole in your gut and a propensity towards addictive propensity, that's going to take you a lot of not helpful places. Even growing up as a Roman Catholic, I was an altar boy at one time, and this was pre-Vatican II Catholicism. So a lot of the beautiful ritual and more mystical quality, and the masses being the call and response chanting in Latin, especially for the high masses. And I like that, even though I lost my faith really early on. I remember being in first or second grade, reciting the catechism and kind of being I just didn't connect with it. And but I enjoyed that part of their ritual, and because I was always attracted to something more meaningful, more kind of mystical, and which is more real, more plugged in. So anyway, there I am with, my adolescence with a big hole in my gut, and I just went headlong into the counterculture of the time. And I graduated from high school in 1968, a very tumultuous year in U.S. history, maybe akin to some of our recent years with everything that's been going on around our reckoning with racism and so forth. But 1968, all the assassinations, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, and just the Kent State massacres, and it was an incredibly tumultuous year. And that was when I graduated from high school and started college, and I just went headlong into the counterculture with all this anger. But I was always a spiritual seeker at the same time. At some point, I left the country, and because I just couldn't handle being in the country anymore. Richard Nixon was reelected, and I was also looking for something real. I started traveling in Central Mexico and Central and Latin America, and I did find some really amazing, vivid, magical things again. But it was all environmental, but anyway, that's where my journey took me. And so, living in as an expat, in order to live outside the system, I fell into small-time drug smuggling as a way to do that, and justified it with all this us versus them thinking, and feeling the whole world is hypocritical, and feeling this is actually an honest thing to do, if you can imagine that. And so that's how I got caught up in all that. But at the same time, I was still a spiritual seeker, and I was trying to meditate on my own, and eventually knew I needed a path and a teacher, and I found Naropa University, founded by Trungpa Rinpoche in 1974, and that began my journey. And so I studied very intensively and practiced very intensively, but I had this split life. I was doing that on the one hand, maybe all put together half the year, and the other half the year I was being this crazy person, because I was still involved, disappearing once or twice a year to South America and smuggling cocaine, and keeping that a secret from my teacher and my community and so forth. So I was living, again, this split life. I've been living a split life ever since childhood. So before I could untangle all of that, I ended up in prison. And I was originally sentenced to 30 years with no parole. And I was 35 years old. My son was 9. I thought my life was over. I hit a wall of absolute devastation on realizing what I'd done to my son, who was now going to grow up without a dad, realizing what I'd done to myself. I'd completely torched my own life, realizing how deeply I'd let down my family and my teachers and my community. And so I went through a real dark night of the soul experience. And I became radically dedicated to getting all the negativity out of my life. And I had no surety that I would survive that time in prison. But I wanted to do anything I could to leave a better legacy for my son than just his dad went to prison or his dad died in prison. So I became really radically dedicated. Unfortunately, I'd already received a lot, so I just started making boundaries with any negativity and really focused on deep spiritual practice. And for 14, I ended up serving 14 years because, fortunately, I was sentenced under the old law in the federal system where they still got a lot of good time. And on my appeal, which took 3 years to go through the courts, they took off 1 count. I had an aggregate sentence of 5 counts. So I reduced my sentence to 25, and then I knew at that point I would serve 14 if I stayed out of trouble. On 30, I would have served 18 and a half if I stayed out of trouble. Unfortunately, I managed to stay out of trouble, which is not easy in prison. So I served 14 inside and then 6 months outside in a halfway house and house arrest. But that time was like my monastery time. It was a horrific environment, very painful environment, very demeaning environment to be in. But I was practicing very intensely and studying intensely, and I got a job teaching school was my day job. This was a federal prison hospital in the height of the AIDS epidemic. So I was able to help start a hospice program, the first one in a prison system anywhere, and then started National Prison Hospice Association to get that model out into the world. There's now 75 or 80 prison hospice programs, and we've literally transformed end-of-life care in prisons, which was horrific prior to that. People were dying of bone cancer, being given Tylenol. There was no pain management. People left alone in their own urine and feces for hours and hours at a time, developing horrible bed sores. It was absolutely horrific. And so it is radically transformed. I'm sure there are still problems, the prison system being what it is, but end-of-life care has been radically changed. And there are now standards for that in the American Correctional Association and National Commission on Healthcare Corrections and so forth. So I had this whole journey there, but the most important thing that I want to connect now to radical responsibility is that when I got there, But there were two things that happened. I'd spent 7 months in this hellhole of a county jail going through trial and sentencing. And then I get to this prison where I'm doing my time. And that was a big relief because it was a big place. You could walk around. There were 10 buildings all connected by these semi-underground tunnels. There was yards. You could go out and walk on the yard. There was a recreation area. So it was a relief to get to this big place. But I remember the first day there quite vividly because this is a maximum security federal prison hospital with about 700 medical patients, 300 psychiatric patients, and then about 300 regular inmates like myself to help run the place, work in food service, housekeeping, what have you. I ended up being a school teacher. And so I remember walking around the halls that first day and seeing men coming out of the psychiatric wards, literally kind of doing the Haldol or Thorazine two-step or out in the yard talking to themselves or trees, men being guided around who were blind, men being wheeled around wheelchairs who were emaciated from cancer or AIDS, or paraplegics or quadriplegics in prison. And, it was like my first hit of it was just almost like this sort of Fellini movie of suffering. And the good thing about that for me personally was when I arrived, I was really caught up in the drama of my own situation. At this point, I'm 35. I believe I'm going to be 65 before I have any chance of release. I feel like I've burned up my whole life and ruined my son's life. And, I'm really caught up in the drama of my own circumstances. But hitting that suffering just shook me out of that, completely shook me out of that, just cut through it. And, all the experience from the influence of my spiritual teacher, who, as far as I could tell, 24/7 lived in service of humanity, the good influences from my family of origin, all that just kicked in. I realized, okay, here I am in this world of tremendous suffering. I need to start showing up and serving here. So how can I be beneficial here? And I also very quickly realized that anything I was going to be able to do that would be good in this place was going to come out of my own practice. So I started dedicating myself to 2 or 3 hours of meditation practice, various contemplative practices on a daily basis. And I just realized that was going to be the ground of my life there and anything I could achieve. I also realized that my involvement in the Buddhist tradition over, 15 years prior, that I'd been ignoring the ethical foundations of Buddhism and focused mostly on awareness and mind and all of that, which a lot of my contemporaries were interested in. But I obviously had ignored the ethical foundations. And so I decided to make that the ground of my journey there, to embrace the basic precepts, the lay precepts to begin with. Later, I took monastic vows with one of the teachers that came in to do some empowerments for me. So, which is just a little more elaborate form of the precepts. And so I decided to completely ground my life in those ethical precepts. And then the other part of it was that I very quickly realized I was in a world now, this world of this maximum security federal prison, of pervasive negativity. And that almost everyone I encountered had a really strong sense of victimization. And when you met a fellow prisoner, the ritual, often you'd go out and walk the yard after lunch or something. And usually the initial ritual is they share their victim story with you and you share your victim story with them. How your fall partner screwed you over, your lawyer, this or that, you were unjustly prosecuted or sentenced or what have you. And, after I went through that a couple of times, I very quickly realized I really didn't want to hear my own experience ever again, if I could help it. I really didn't want to hear other people's victim stories, which probably wasn't very compassionate, but that's not the world I wanted to live in. And also just really, even though, in prison there's humor and mostly kind of dark humor, but you just scratch the surface and ask the right question of anybody, and just out comes all this anger and bitterness. Because when people are incarcerated, we're immediately just buried under a mountain of demonization. The whole process of arrest, prosecution, going to prison, the whole thing, you're just being demonized and turned into a non-human and buried under a mountain of demonization and shame and blame and so forth, to whatever level justified or not. That's just the process. And so instinctively, to survive that, we try to armor ourselves up. And generally, we armor ourselves up with anger and bitterness and some kind of victim story, right? Just to sort of psychically survive, to psychologically, emotionally survive. And that's really counterproductive because our process of real transformation begins when, at least in part, when we can actually get in touch with the harm we've caused, and not for self-blame, but get in touch with deep levels of regret and remorse, which I was able to do, especially initially already what had happened to my son. But as I went through, I was involved in recovery groups, 12-step recovery groups. And after listening to the story of one man, it's a male prison, one man after another, how their lives unraveled around cocaine and so forth, I realized I'd been involved in something extremely harmful. And I felt incredible levels of remorse and regret. And my deepest longing became just to not cause any more harm. And that's a very transformative place, and took my spiritual journey to a whole new level. So that's very hard to access for most prisoners because they're busy trying to survive. So it was a really angry world, bitter world. And I didn't want to, I had enough experience already, thank goodness, that I didn't want to come out of prison if I managed to survive my time, broken, embittered, angry. And I also didn't want to live that way there. And so I realized the only way that I was not going to end up that way was to embrace radical 100%, even 200% ownership for having got myself into that circumstance. And I could easily see I did plenty to get myself there, although there are all kinds of people. I did a lot of people's time. I was one person who I refused to testify. That was just never anything I was going to do because, somebody else going to prison instead of me never made sense to me. It didn't align with my Buddhist values. But a lot of people did. And so, and then, when anytime you're prosecuted, they break all the rules, they play hardball. So I could have focused on all that, but I decided to just erase all that, just completely forget about it and focus on radical ownership for having got myself there and what I was going to do with my time there. And to the extent that I still had any feelings toward other people that may have, helped along my process of incarceration and former associates, I engaged in a contemplative practice called Tonlin, exchanging self for other, from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, to dissolve any enmity. And I really worked at that very hard. And even within a few years of being into prison, that was all gone. I don't have the slightest enmity towards anyone. If I met anyone from my past, I could meet them as a fellow human being with empathy, compassion, and kindness and genuine interest in their life. So, but I really worked hard at all that. So that's really where this began. And what it led to, the last point I'll make there, what it led to in prison was being able to accomplish things that you're not supposed to be able to accomplish in prison, right? So, prison, maximum security prison, sociologists call it a total institution, which means it's like a totalitarian state. Resistance is literally futile. And in this particular prison that had the psychiatric ward, if you literally tried to buck the system, you'd end up in a hole to begin with, right? In what they call administrative seg or solitary confinement. If you kept bucking the system in there, you'd end up in a psych ward in 4-point restraints on a concrete bunk being hosed out at night and probably pumped through to hell at all. This is a place where resistance was literally futile. And the staff, the authorities had all the power. So it's hard to imagine being in a more powerless situation, right? And I wanted to do something with my life. Most prisoners, when they're in prison, are just trying to get through the time. If it's a long time, they numb out. You just try to get a routine going and numb out and just not experience it. But I was already a practitioner, so of course I wanted to experience life in its fullness. And I wanted to keep my heart open, and I wanted this to be part of my journey, whatever it was going to be. And I also wanted to accomplish something. So I was teaching school, which was very gratifying, helping other prisoners learn to read or get a GED or study for college classes. And I also started a lot of other kind of self-improvement courses. So I wanted to do good with my life there. And so I had to figure out, how do you do that? Because when you asked a staff person, could we try this? Could we try? The answer was always no. And if you were, audacious enough to say why, which could get you in trouble, they'd say they'd always had a story. Well, we used to do that and some inmate did this, so we don't do it anymore. They abused it, we don't do it anymore. There's always a story why we don't do this, right? So in that kind of environment, how do you get anything done? Fortunately, my first spiritual teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, had really emphasized skillfulness over right and wrong. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't that he didn't have any sense of right or wrong, but it was more sense of, it was a less blame-based way of what's skillful, what's work, what works, right? How do you interact with people skillfully? Not getting into, well, they should do this, and I'm angry they won't do this, and it's all their fault that they won't do this, but rather, okay, here I'm in a situation. This person is a correctional officer, a prison chaplain, an administrator, an associate warden, whoever I'm dealing with, my boss at work. How can I relate with them as a human being to find a way forward to accomplish some good things, right? And so I was taking radical responsibility for my interactions in order to be able to accomplish good things. And taking that approach, not only was I able to start all kinds of programs in that prison, and I was in touch with a warden probably 10 years after I got out, or maybe longer, who was the warden after I left. Wardens exchange, they usually change wardens every few years anyway. When he got there, he said he was hearing about me nonstop and continue to hear about me. And I would say that to pat myself on the back. It's just to show what taking this approach can accomplish, right? Because you can't imagine being in a more powerless situation. So not only was I able to create all kinds of very innovative programs there, including this hospice program, the first in any prison in the world that we know of, but also I was able to start 2 national organizations and catalyze 2 national movements. Prison Dharma Network, which helped catalyze a prison Dharma, prison meditation, prison mindfulness movement, and National Prison Hospice Association that took this model we developed there and got it out into the world. And you're not supposed to be able to do any of that as a prisoner. If I'd walked up and said, "Can I start?" They would have said, "You're crazy." No, I just did it. I didn't hide it, but I just, I ran into a prisoner in the school. When I got a job right away in a school, there was a guy already working there who was actually creating a lot of interesting stuff. And I said, "How do you do that?" I understand, because I know they don't, he goes, "Well, I'll give you a little advice here." He was an interesting guy. He was a psychologist. And he said, when you want to do something, first check out your motivation and make sure it's really clean. Like, really check it out and get really clear that you have a clean motivation to do this. And then take all the authority you need to do it and not 1 ounce more. And then as soon as you don't need that anymore, let it go. And I found that to be actually very, very good advice. So along with that and this radical responsibility approach, I was able to do things in prison that you're not supposed to be able to do. I knew by the time 1 count was dropped on my appeal and I figured out the good time, and I knew I'd get out after 14 years if I stayed out of trouble. I knew I'd be just about near my 50th birthday when I get out. And how do you start a life at 50, right? When you've got a serious criminal record. I was going to be deeply in debt to the IRS, right? But I worked really hard for those 14 years, taking this approach and always keeping in the forefront of my mind this approach of radical ownership, radical responsibility. And I've had nothing but opportunity ever since. I've been out now for 23 years, and I've had nothing but opportunity. Been traveling the world teaching and able to add value and receive value from life and in good ways. So that gives you some background on this radical responsibility model. I want to apply this to the larger landscape we're in for a minute. We're going to open it up for questions in about 5 minutes. So as we all know, and I just want to forewarn you, please, I invite us to embodiment again. I haven't remembered to do that. So invite us back into embodiment. And really just honoring whatever we're feeling. So what I'm going to talk about right now may be a little more challenging territory. And again, I just want to say this is my own experience, my own opinions. I don't lay claim to any truths, but I'm going to lay out this landscape here, most of which will be familiar to you, but we may have different ideas about it. So we all know that we live here in the U.S. and largely in the West, but I'll talk about here in the U.S. Our socio-political landscape, cultural landscape, has become incredibly polarized. Incredibly divisive. Our politics has gotten so polarized and so divisive that it's almost, on some levels, it's almost cartoon-like at times, especially with, the recent, not the current, but the former president. It's just stuff that's hard to believe that it could have gotten to this level, right? That it could have gotten to this level. And we know most of us understand how this is being highly exacerbated by social media, by the algorithms that drive social media that really prioritize outrage in social media, right? A politician who is a relatively reasonable moderate who still believes in having real dialogue and finding compromise to move government and society forward, right? Which is the responsibility of governance. If they take that approach, their Twitter likes or their Facebook likes are going to be almost nil, right? They won't attract anything. if you want to get, really important when you're a public figure, the number of, Twitter followers you have and so forth. Well, the more polarizing you are from the right or the left, the more followers you get. So the politicians are driven to the extremes. There's all kinds of forces now driving us to the extremes. And it's gotten to the place where our political system is really in complete breakdown, right? And that's been going on for a while. I mean, whoever gets in power, whether it's the Democrats or Republicans have control of Congress, the other side is just trying to undermine everything they do and have them completely fail. So in 2 years, they can get back in power. And with the 4-year presidential elections, the same thing. So there's no interest in cooperating to move the country forward. It's just simply this game of power. That's all it is. And all this is really exacerbated by social media, obviously. And also by a culture, an American cultural phenomenon that's developed over many years, which is we have this kind of winner-take-all culture. This is in the world of media and sports. It used to be anybody in the entertainment industry made really good money. Now the money is all at the top. Same thing in sports. The money always goes to the top, driven by people's agents and lawyers. It's sort of like we have a culture here where we all know about the idea of the 1% and the rest of us. So, we've developed a culture where it's just, and, we could blame all kinds of people for that. But, there really is no other people. There's just us. We all collectively participate in this culture. So somehow culturally, this is where we've evolved to where, most of the resources go to the top. And politically, one party wants to get in and then just shove their agenda down the throats of the rest of the country, right? Until they get kicked out. And then the other party's going to get in and do the same. Any idea of compromise or a middle way or a way that honors everybody's needs, it's just become completely absent from our political landscape. So government is in complete breakdown. We don't really have any kind of effective governance. And it's all about winning and losing. It's about everybody's got their home team, right? It's like sports or something. And I'm sure we all have our home team and we all have our particular political leanings. And, we probably feel right. That kind of comes right in there with having political leanings, is we feel we're right about them or we wouldn't have them, right? And, that sense of being right is actually highly problematic the more tightly we hold on to that. So the last idea, and we'll have a chance to explore this more experientially tomorrow, and we can bring it up in the Q&A now as well, is how are we going to get beyond that? Because traditionally, the left really wants to focus on collective responsibility. And they don't like the term personal responsibility. In fact, I was at a gathering a couple of years ago at a meditation center where we were having some dialogue about things going on in the community in the center. And I brought up the word personal responsibility in a very neutral context. And one person just got outraged that I would even use that word because he just felt that word in of itself is so hurtful, right? And that's kind of and then on the right, they don't want to hear anything about collective responsibility. It's all about personal responsibility, right? And neither side wants to give an inch because they feel even using the term is a slippery slope to damnation, right? From either side's perspective. And of course, if any of us reflect, we all know, if we're willing to take a moment, reflect in terms of our personal lives or our social lives, our nation's life, it's got to be the integration of both. It's got to be both personal responsibility and collective responsibility. Like individuals, they may need a lot of support to find their way there, but individuals, if they want their lives to flourish, have to embrace some level of personal responsibility. And we also have to be collectively responsible to make that as easy as we can for people and remove the unjust obstacles. But it's a blend of both, and it has to be. It's just common sense that it has to be. So that's the idea of developing a model that is a full integration of personal and collective responsibility for the purpose of both personal and social transformation, that we could find a way through this complete breakdown we're in now, where the information ecology is in complete breakdown. There's no trustworthy source of news or information anymore. I don't know if people are tuned in to Rebel Wisdom, a wonderful project out of the UK that's been involved for the last 7 years now. They've been trying to interview some of those brilliant people in the world and find our way to a more a clearer signal, in terms of information. There's Daniel Smachtenberg's work and others with the Consilience Project, where they're trying to develop something like that. But, all the media now, it's all spin. Even the BBC that used to have a reputation for being objective, pure spin. And this is not me. This is, you can do your research and see, there's organizations that assess all these and assess the level of political spin. Still, the one periodical that has the most unbiased reputation for a long time, and is still the best today, is the Christian Science Monitor, actually. So how do we get out of that morass? And I'm suggesting that this is the way through. Okay, so we'll open it up to questions now.
Great, thank you very much. So, and we have some rich questions in response to your profound insight. We begin with first just a expression of gratitude for the unique feature of grounding into the innate goodness, the innate purity that the contemplative practices provides, and how that distinguishes your model. And from there, the questions that I'll start with are just coming back to your own lived experience in prison. There's interest in knowing how much contact you were able to have with your teacher, and what framework and container for your continued contemplative life was available to you.
Yeah, thank you. Good question. Well, the truth is, I was largely on my own, not for lack of support from my community. My teacher, my teacher died. I went into prison in 1985, and my teacher died in 1987. Mm-hmm. We did have a phone call not long after I went to prison. And now the prison I was in Southwest Missouri, which it's not a strong area for contemplative things, right? It's considered one of the buckles of the Bible Belt, really strong evangelical area, right? We did end up having a couple of local volunteers that would come in and sit with our group. I led a meditation group, Buddhist meditation group. It was open to everybody, but it was a meditation group for 14 years. It met twice a week, and we had a couple of local people that would come in and sit with us. But and I did have some friends in my core Buddhist community, Shambhala community, that came and visited me. Usually once or twice a year, I got a visit from somebody. In order to continue my practice, my teacher's Dharma era came around 89 or somewhere in there, came and gave me a set of empowerments so I could continue my practices in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, practices that I would ideally have completed before I went to prison, but because of my kind of crazy mixed lifestyle, I hadn't. If anybody's familiar with that, they're called the Nundro, or preliminary practices, doing 100,000 prostrations, doing 100,000 of this purification mantra, 100,000 of another practice called mandala, and then 1,000,000 recitations of another practice. And people take anywhere from a couple of years to years and years and years and years to complete that. But I'd only completed 20,000 prostrations. And it took me 2 years to get a single room, but once I got a single cell, I was able to get up early in the morning and do them. And I completed all that very quickly. And then I was very fortunate that another teacher in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition came in and to give me another set of empowerments, then move on and become a sadhaka and do various sadhana practices. And it was when he came in, Venerable Trungpa Rinpoche, and I also took monastic vows with him at that time, the novice monastic vows. So I did have those influences. I was also corresponding with Pema Chodron once I took monastic vows, because she's a monk, obviously, and I knew her quite well already. We're in the same sangha, and so she was corresponding with me around my monastic, trying what it meant to be a monk in prison, and so I had that support. I corresponded with a lot of people, a lot of support through correspondence, but day to day I was largely on my own. But I'd already received so much from my teacher. I'd received a lot, and so anyway, yeah, that was a picture. Later on, my teacher's son, who's now the head of our lineage, later on in my time, he came in to do another set of empowerments so I could continue with other practices. And he also did a refuge ceremony for some of the men in our Buddhist group at that time who wanted to formally enter the Buddhist path. So that was later on in my time. And then also, became very early on. I became very interested in the work of my Zen teacher, Roshi Glassman, who is renowned for the street retreats and the Graceland mandala, working with people coming out of homelessness and really, engaged Zen, engaged Buddhism, and who started the Zen Peacemaker movement, worldwide movement. So early on, when he was developing Graceland, I became very interested in what he was doing, and then at some point, he created an ordination for what was called a Zen Peacemaker priest. And that really just penetrated my heart and is what I wanted to do, to really take up the robe and bowl of the Buddha, to formally live the life of an ordained monk, but have your ministry be in the street, not in a monastery. And so I wrote to him, and he was very affirmative right off the bat, and said he'd love to work with me. And I wrote to my principal teacher in the Shambhala tradition and asked permission, and he gave permission. And so I started studying Zen at that point as well. And Bernie and his then wife, Jishu, Senator Holmes, who sadly died right about the time right before I got out of prison. But Bernie and Jishu came to the prison quite a number of times the last 3 or 4 years I was there, and also corresponded with me a lot. And I actually ended up, they came in to do a Zen rite of passage with me. And then later on came in to ordain me as a novice Zen Peacemaker priest. That all happened. So I had all that kind of support, but day to day, I was living in a very isolated part of the country in terms of all that kind of stuff. And I was pretty much, it was up to me to do it.
Thank you for illuminating the framework in which you did your work. We have a second area of questions that ask about your interaction with the staff of the prison, and whether your sharing of Dharma and contemplative practices included prison guards, psychologists, and other employees of the prison.
Yeah, no, it did not directly. There's really, when you're inside a correctional facility, there's a real intense divide between the staff and the prisoners, the incarcerated. And both sides are pretty invested in that divide. And you have to be really careful about that. And, I wasn't, I knew that my fellow prisoners, that was my community. I had no doubts about that. At the same time, I wasn't embracing the convict mentality. I didn't want to embrace that kind of mentality. Also I kept my distance with the staff. I mean, you interact with your boss at work or whoever you have to interact with, people in the chapel, because of my involvement there with the hospice program. I had relationships with certain staff, but you're still careful about how you do that. If there are other staff around, you keep things, you keep things you stay pretty formal anyway, but you don't, so you got to be really careful about those boundaries. And in some ways, the staff didn't know what to do with me, because they prefer that you're just, act like a normal convict, and you get busted for this and that, and you go to the hole every now, because then they can just dismiss you and regard you as just another thug. And, my fellow prisoners weren't quite sure what to do with me either, but fortunately I stayed very much in relationship with them, helped a lot of them get their GED, was, caring for their friends who were living up in the hospital with, dying of AIDS and cancer and so forth. So I had very strong relationships with my fellow prisoners, although both sides didn't quite know what to do with me. But I think there was some respect, because in prison, if you lead a very disciplined life, people respect that, and they may not understand what you're doing, but they realize you're serious about it. You earn respect that way. And I led a really, really disciplined life in there. So, but there weren't opportunities to share that kind of thing really with staff there. Now, today, a big part of my work is training correctional officers, probation, parole officers, police, and other first responders is a big part of my work today. But back then, the boundaries wouldn't really allow that. Now, I'm sure I influenced a few staff that were involved with the hospice program. Probably maybe my bosses at work, I would talk to them about things. I wasn't trying to proselytize anybody or anything like that, but, there may have been some influences. I remember one funny thing. There was when I got there was a wonderful a Catholic nun who came in as a volunteer, and she was like in her early 80s, and she had a long career as an educator in East St. Louis, an order of sisters of nuns that taught schools and in a really impoverished areas, East St. Louis, Illinois, African American communities largely. And anyway, she'd had a long teaching career doing that, and she was in retirement now and lived in a convent somewhere in there in Springfield, Missouri. But she came into the prison regularly. And she spent a lot of time up in the hospital meeting with men, and they loved her because she just met people where they were and just loved them up. And, people loved her. And, but early on when she had, we first met and talked a few times, she found out I was a former Catholic, right? So I'm a lapsed Catholic, right? So she's trying to bring me back to the two folds. So for like the first year, the conversations were always about trying to remind me that I'm a Catholic. But then after about a year or two, things shifted. And then she was starting to tell me about the latest Pema Chodron book she was reading. So she I didn't influence her in that way. She was just, there's a lot of the Catholic contemplative world and the Buddhist contemplative world. There's been a lot of bridges and connections. So anyway, she started going in that direction. So she quit trying to bring me back to the fold.
Thank you for that story. We have another question that says, how did your confinement to one location for so long influence your relationship to movement, both in terms of movement of your body and in terms of moving through the world and exploring the world when you were in the same location?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Kind of a pretty deep question. Thank you. So, yeah, I was in one place for a long time. And, we had television. I didn't spend much time watching television. We also could have our own little Walkman radio in our cell with headphones. And I was really I was pretty religious at that point. I was just really on fire with dedicated to turning my life. And so I allowed myself to listen to a little bit of NPR every now and then. And once a week, I let myself listen to a music program at night. I mean, that's how kind of strict I was. But anyway, you had a vague sense that what was going on in the world, right? I wasn't a news junkie at all, but you had a vague sense of life was going on, the world was changing, things going on. So it wasn't complete mystery. But yeah, I remember, I was asked while I was in prison quite a few times, and I know lots of prison volunteers have been asked this, that when people go to teach meditations in prison, our prison wants them to, how do you do astral travel? I want to learn astral travel. Well, obviously, it makes a lot of sense. If you're in prison, if you could learn how to do astral travel, you could journey all over the place, right? In your dreams or while you're sleeping or whatever. But I didn't have that to offer them. So, and I didn't really focus on that myself. But one thing that question does bring up, when I got out of prison, I first got out, they let me out 5 months before I was supposed to get out temporarily to go to my father's funeral. It was a really incredibly painful and powerful experience. My father was dying of cancer, and my family wanted me to come home. The only way they would let me go home was with 2 guards and in ankle chains and a belly chain. That's the way I would be escorted into the hospital to see my father. And I just refused to do it. I'd already felt like I'd brought so much shame to my family. My trial, by weird circumstances, well, the government did it to get the notoriety. My family had a family business in St. Louis, where I grew up. They weren't super wealthy or anything, but it was a good family business that advertised on TV. So the name was well known, and they over time became relatively prominent people in that city. And so that's why the government had my trial there, because they got a lot of notoriety. So it's brought tremendous embarrassment and shame to my family. And so I didn't want to bring any more of that to them, even though they were saying come anyway. And then my father died. I got the word that he had died. The chaplain came up to see me. And then the very next morning, I get a call. The guard comes to my door and says, "You're going." And I said, "Where am I going?" He said, "You're going out. They're letting you out to go to your father's funeral." So they took me down, and they gave me $50 out of my commissary account, and they gave me a kind of cheap suit to wear or a sport coat or something, and took me out the front door and opened the door, and said there's a taxi waiting there for you, and you've got a ticket at the airport. So there I am standing on the steps, free for the first time in 14 years. And I'll never forget, it was absolutely blue sky day, and they had 3 flagpoles there, and the flags were beating in the wind like that. And I was just devastated with loss and grief of losing my father. And one of my deepest longings was for him to see me out of prison and doing okay. I think by this time he knew I was going to be okay. Very proud of the things I was accomplishing inside. But I really, and so I was just devastated and losing my father. And yeah, it was the same time I'm experiencing the outside world. It was such a mixed, kind of intensely vivid experience. And I remember then the taxi arrived, and I just kind of wanted to be friendly. I guess I got in the front seat, which was a big mistake. And it was this woman was a taxi driver, kind of a grandmotherly woman, looked like in her 60s or something. And to me, it just felt like she took off like a bat out of hell. And the whole time riding to the airport, I'm just like, whoa, I think I'm going to die any second, because my body hadn't moved. I hadn't been in a car. I hadn't been, it was just things felt so fast. And then when I did get out 5 months later, it was frightful actually, even to cross streets at first. I was in a halfway house, but to walk to where I was going to work, or, the world just felt like it was going so fast and moving so fast. And I was in this kind of altered state of sorts for the first 3 months that I got out, because everything was so unfamiliar and vivid and moving so fast and everything. Eventually, I kind of got used to it, and that dampened down. And they wouldn't let me travel at first. I couldn't leave. I released to Boulder, Colorado, where I'd been living before I went in, and they wouldn't let me leave Boulder County. And then they wouldn't let me leave the state. But eventually, they did give me permission to start traveling. It was kind of triggered by a woman who'd been my girlfriend before I went to prison and had been my best friend during those years. She got cancer and was dying. So they gave me permission. She was in Canada. They gave me permission to let me get a passport to go see her. And that kind of opened up travel. And previous to that, my mother died 5 months after I got out of prison, and they let me go home for the funeral. So I was at those two funerals. But eventually, once I got a passport, I started getting invited to do things all around the world and started traveling, and ended up evolving a life of kind of being a road warrior, living on the road, traveling constantly up until the pandemic began. And I've been very grateful to again be in one place with my beautiful wife, Sophie, and we have a nice little home and a nice quiet little New England village. And I've been basically in one place for over 2 years, and I'm really loving it. So maybe I developed a greater affinity for that being in prison.
Thank you. Another question says, can you maybe share a little more about your relationship with your mother? In your journey, have you found peace and healing in that relationship?
Yes. Yes, deeply so. So, it was always a mixed relationship for me, because, when she wasn't drinking, she was a wonderful, and I was considered her favorite in the family. So I guess that's why she also took out the rage on me as well. But the family always talked about me being the favorite. And I was the literal black sheep of the family. I'm the only one that left St. Louis. And, I was traveling in Latin America, as I described before. And, I'd often just show up out of the blue for my mother's birthday or something like that, or, and the family joke was all of a sudden, as soon as I get home, the food gets better. We start, my mom's making cherry pies and things. And so I guess, maybe there was some truth to it, me being her favorite somewhat. But so it was just a really mixed thing and a painful thing. And, she also was adamant that I never make her alcoholism public in any way, even in relation to my case or anything, and she was very, clear. I could tell there was so much fear. And my first hit was that, love is not unconditional, right? Because she basically threatened to disown me if I ever made that public. And even, which is kind of weird because it was pretty public in her world anyway. But I later realized it was just a fear, that was just her deep fear response, And so it was all mixed up like that. But, I was in my contemplative practice in prison, I was doing this practice called Tonglen. It's a compassion practice. And it's called exchanging self for other on the medium of the breath. And it has to be done in a ground of tremendous self-compassion. It's very important to have that connection to one's own basic goodness. It's a pretty radical practice, really, where you're willing to take on the suffering of others, and you're willing to give away anything you would normally want to hold on to for yourself. So it's kind of completely reversing the logic of ego, of a self-orientation. And so, I did a lot of practice with my mother, all kinds of people. But so I was very actively working with using contemplative tools to heal that relationship. But then towards the end of my time, about 4 years before I got out, maybe it started 5 years before I got out, I don't know, but I got in relationship with a community on the outside. they approached me because I'd published a lot of writings from inside prison, and they found those and wanted to use them in their program. So they wrote to me, and I realized they were doing some really interesting. So we got in relationship, and the founder of that working community came to see me in prison. We just connected like completely long lost spiritual brothers. So it's just an immediate connection. And one of the things that he did and his community did was offer this really powerful training called the event. And so I got very interested in trying to get that into the prison. And I had a relationship with two psychologists, one who was the one who oversaw the 12-step programs, and the other who was the medical surgical psychologist. So he was involved with our hospice program. And I approached both of them about it. And it just so happened that they were going to be doing an event in that town where the prison was. And so they both went and did it. And they loved it. And then they figured out how to get it into the prison. And it was miraculous that it came in, because if the prison officials had known what it was, they never would have let it in. And there was this one room up on the top of the building that the dining hall and the recreation, it was one big, huge building. And on top, there was one small room that didn't take up the whole building. It was just this isolated room up there at the very top. And that's where we did our 12-step groups and things like that. And it was only because that room existed we could do it, because the event training is, it's a very intense group process and very loud, a lot of yelling, and and it involves stick work. It's very intense. You create this very bonded community, and then very quickly take people into their family of origin dynamics, where a lot of trauma originates, and then help people shift their relationship to that. So we did 4 of them during the last 3 years that I was inside prison, with about 30 men each time. Incredibly deep transformational work. And it was amazing to see, it was a collected group of men that I mostly recruited into the trainings, but they were of every racial background, of every kind of criminal background. And inevitably, once they got safe and started, holding each other while they're deeply sharing childhood traumas, 90% of them had experienced some kind of severe childhood trauma. Physical, emotional, or sexual, or all 3. It's just severe stuff. I mean, what I went through was nothing compared to what I witnessed so many of these men. And you realize no wonder they're in prison. It's a wonder they're alive in many cases. You realize how people are literally programmed by these experiences to end up in prison. Now, at some point, they got to embrace, in my view, with a lot of self-compassion and compassion for others, they still need to embrace choice if they want to get themselves through and out of prison. But it's no mystery how they ended up there, right? And so anyway, in that training, I did a lot of work around my mom a number of times, and some really powerful work that really liberated. It helped heal my relationship with my mother, but also I also got this deep insight despite all the contemplative work I'd done. And when I went through my master's, which was a 3-year clinical training program, I was in some kind of therapy the whole time, group therapy, really intense stuff. And I'd done all that work and all this work. And despite all that, I realized that in that training that I was still on some level, moment to moment, day to day, living out my mom and dad issues. On some level that was still there, still trying to prove them right, prove them wrong, appease them, get their love. I mean, it was just coloring. It's hard to see that. It's so deep, that conditioning. And seeing that just opened up a whole new level of personal work for me to really get free of that. And I've continued that work to this day. But I was really able to heal that relationship with my mother through that work.
Could you name some opportunities you're aware of in the country to do that kind of work?
Well, I think the internal family systems work is very good. I really highly recommend that. And it's offered both in therapeutic context, but it's offered also in a more of a training setting for people, I think. I still lead the event. We haven't done it during the pandemic because we try to figure out how to do something online. And it's just, I'm doing almost everything I used to do in person online, but that one we couldn't figure out. Mm-hmm. So I hope that we'll start leading the event again in another year. It's called, the website is theeventtraining.com, theeventtraining.com. There's a training, well-known training that I think may be somewhat related, called the quadrenity process. I've heard good things about it. I haven't experienced it directly, but it's somewhat related, the quadrenity process. There are some elements contextually within the forum, which is, worldwide available training. It's not as deeply, it's in no way as deeply contemplative in the way we present the event. It doesn't, but contextually, it is helping people really grasp this idea of living a choice and some of these things. So that's widely available.
Thank you. Our next question is, how do you think about the concept of internal risk-taking in relation to radical responsibility? How can we make the decision to take risk? And the context is the writing of the question says, I'm thinking mostly in terms of personal and interpersonal risk, like putting work into a challenging relationship through courageous conversations, or choosing to make a pivot and a life change with the unsure outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Well, everything we're able to do in our lives with ourselves and with others, the ability to do that skillfully and in a beneficial way depends on our own resilience, our own internal resources, and our own internal clarity, right? So self-care is really always the foundation for me. Everything we can do to take care of ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And there's a lot of, there's so many different resources for that. And of course, even just how we take care of the pillars physically, with diet and exercise and sleep and breath work. And, and I really encourage, we all have this autonomic nervous system that runs 99% of what's going on in our body. And it has these two branches, one upregulates and one downregulates. And unless we embrace ownership for managing that, guess who's managing it? Everybody but us, right? And we live in this interface between our childhood conditioning, which we had nothing to say about. We got most of it by the time we were 3 and almost all of it by the time we were 7. And just that whole family legacy of unprocessed stuff gets handed off to us to do our best with. And then the world around us. And there we are. And, if we had really benevolent childhood and we live in a really benevolent place, maybe that's okay to live in there, not so mindfully and kind of habitually or reactively. But most of us didn't have a completely benevolent childhood. And the world we're living in is not highly benevolent, except on a very big scale, universal kind of deep level. But in the relative terms, it's not very benevolent. So, that can be a really rough ride to just be in there being bounced around in that reactivity between the world we're in and our own conditioning. So the way we step into ownership is by embracing responsibility for managing our own neurophysiology to begin with. And breath work is the key to that, right? And so I think developing these resources are all foundational to then leaning into having challenging reflections with ourselves, having challenging conversations with others, and having community support is really important. I do a lot of circle work. I'm a teacher of the way of counsel and lots of other types of circle work. And I love an expression, Starhawk, who's a well-known activist and kind of self-described Wiccan priestess, I think. She has done a lot of circle work and written about circle work. And she said, circles are safe places to do unsafe things. Safe places to do unsafe things. In other words, to do challenging things, right? So how do we create that safe place for ourselves, within ourselves, physiologically, emotionally, mentally, cognitively? How do we create support systems and relationships? How can we create communities around doing the difficult work? So I think safety is always around. Now, safety, not, if we take safety too far, we're going to live in a bubble and never be willing to challenge ourselves, right? So it's, leaning in. Another helpful concept I encourage people to check out is Daniel Goleman's, all of Daniel Goleman's, Daniel Goleman's work is wonderful on emotional intelligence. I meant Dr. Dan Siegel. So Dan Siegel's, all of his work and his books are wonderful, but his idea of the window of tolerance, understanding our own window of tolerance. And that's when we're in that range of our own neurobiological, working, that we can be in a responsive relational mode with whatever's occurring in our life, as opposed to getting triggered into a fear-based conditioned reactive mode, right? And there are all kinds of things that will trigger us out of that window of tolerance, or what I like to call the zone of resilience. And we can learn practices to recognize when we're starting to get triggered out and how we come back. But we can also expand, because that window of tolerance or zone of resilience shrinks over the lifespan. When you're a little infant, it's infinite. But with the bumps and bruises of life, physical, emotional, different things, well, I'm not going to do that again. Well, that was shaming. That wasn't good. And our life shrinks. That happens to all of us. And then our traumas will shrink even more. And with extreme PTSD, some people end up agoraphobic. They can't even leave their home, right? That's too triggering. So how ample is our window of tolerance? So there's all the contemplative skills we can use to expand our window of tolerance and learn how to quickly get back to it when we are triggered out of it. But part of that expanding it is leaning into the edges of it. You lean into what's challenging, you come back to some place that's safe. So you develop a home ground of, you know how to get to your safe spot, you know how to get to your good place, you know, in all kinds of different physical, emotional, mental ways, spiritual ways. And then you lean into what's challenging and you come back. You lean, that's from Peter Levine's work, Somatic Experiencing, he calls that pendulating. You lean into what feels challenging and then you come back to what's okay. You lean in, and that way we can gradually re-expand our window of tolerance or zone of resilience.
Dr. Maull, thank you for this exquisite brocade of wisdom that you've woven together from your direct experience and devoted personal practice. We look forward to being with you tomorrow afternoon for the interactive workshop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I look forward to it as well. I look forward to being able to see people tomorrow. It's been wonderful being with you, Doctor, but I look forward to being able to see everybody tomorrow and getting engaged in the work together.
Thank you. We'll see you tomorrow.
Okay. Be well.